number one cause of death among free divers is shallow drowning. They're down at the bottom. They have a warning that it's time to head to the surface, but they're reaching for one more thing: an abalone, a lobster, a shellfish of some kind. And by the time they get the one more thing and start to the surface, their timing has gotten them to the point that they drown just within inches of the surface. So that to me was a descriptor of the way I was doing ministry. It was death by one more thing. And so the solution was brilliant, built into the fabric of creation. God rested at the end of the creative process, and in doing that rest, set in place a rhythm that in Jewish theological reflection provided the foundation for what they called the eighth day, which was the work of Eden and so on and so forth. So rest is the foundation for work. You see this codified in the creative order where it's evening and morning that is the first day, not morning and evening the way we think of it. Evening and morning, the first day. So the very first thing that happens every day is rest. Then we awake to engage with God in work that He's already doing from that position of rest. It's not for nothing then that when Jesus invites us to come to Him as we are weary and worn, that the very first thing He does is hit the redo button and give us rest, right? But then He says, now learn how to work from me. Take my yoke on you. Learn my life. Learn how I would live if I were you, because I'm meek and humble of heart. And when you do that, He said, you'll find rest for your souls. So rest from, during, and to is supposed to characterize our ministries. And to the degree that it doesn't is probably the degree to which we haven't learned to reestablish rest on a regular and weekly basis. First three, love God. Commandments 5 through 9, love your neighbor. Commandment 4, Sabbath, love yourself. So 4 becomes the transition between loving God well and loving neighbor well by loving self well. And so that sets the frame foundationally, at least for me theologically, for what Sabbath we're invited into. I think burnout is probably the most readily seen thing. We work harder but get less done. We get anxious and afraid and minister out of insecurity instead of a place of rest and security. Henry Nouwen says that our two primary motivations in ministry become greed and anger. And I think those descriptors arise because we don't know and have a regular way of reaffirming who we are, which is what the Sabbath is supposed to do. The rationale, for example, in both Exodus and Deuteronomy are, remember that you're created and remember that you're redeemed. That's what Sabbath reinforces in us. So when we forget that we're created, we become animals. When we forget that we're redeemed, we become slaves. And so ministry functions as if we were just part of the equipment of the doing, or it becomes a kind of form of slavery. So what that means is my marriage suffered, almost to the point of breaking. My ministry, I was angry, increasingly angry at my congregation because they weren't working as hard as I thought they ought to be, and so on and so forth. I kept on creating programs that then I felt I obligated to go to. Resentment began to kick in. I mean, there's just a range of things that happen when you're just trying harder and harder and harder with less and less and less effect. And God's strategy is, no, rest first, then join me in what I'm doing, in the way that I'm doing it, and at the outcome there will be rest for your soul. So it's a matter of scheduling. We believe in the infallibility of the day timer of our schedule. That doesn't mean we have to start with 24 hours at once. If you can't do 24, do 12. If you can't do 12, do 6. If you can't do 6, do 3. Start somewhere, because out of that rest comes the push towards health for more. And one of the things you'll discover, I think, at least this is my experience, is that it's like budgeting for money. If you set a budget for your income and what it's going to be spent on, just the awareness of the budget enables better stewardship of the money. And some estimates range as high as 20% realized increase simply by paying attention. So I think Sabbath works the same way with time. When I set aside one day in 7 in which I choose to do no work, choose to pray, choose to play, choose friendships, choose those life-giving kinds of things and activities, that then provides energy for the remainder of the work week. I think we need to make a distinction between Sabbath as Sabbath and Sabbath as day off. Day off ends up becoming the dumpster of the week, in which we crowd in things that we didn't have time to get through. But it becomes another form of work. So I have found it helpful to have a separate day that's a day off. Doesn't have to be on Sunday. In fact, for most of us in vocational ministry, that's just not a practical option. Most of the time, I notice that ministers take days off on Monday, which may or may not be helpful. Usually Mondays are days of adrenaline drain from the exertions of the work week of ministry. So that is less restful in some ways, and especially for those of you, those who are in your community, a spouse or children, they get the depressed adrenaline drain. So some other day in the week tends to work just structurally better, because then I can come to Sabbath with my full self rather than dragging myself into it. It becomes maybe on an occasional basis a spiritual retreat day of 3 to 6 hours in which you and Jesus grab a cup of coffee and sit in a coffee shop, or sit overlooking the beach, or up in the mountains, or a Joshua tree, or someplace that is refreshing to your soul, and you listen without agenda to God tell you that He loves you and that He cares about you and that He knows where you're at and what you're going through. Those retreat days can be incorporated easily into the Sabbath as long as we go into them without demand, that they go in unstructured, that they go in with a minimal amount of anxiety in God's presence. Because I think sometimes what happens in our prayer is that we kind of worry in God's presence and call that prayer, as opposed to going without an agenda or without a to-do list and letting God set the agenda and talk to us about what He wants to speak to us about. It's not a time to work on your sermon. It's not really a time to work on your devotional life per se. It's not a time to work on a Bible study or solve a problem, although it is not uncommon that in that season of rest, solutions emerge, inspiration emerges, things come together, but that happens when we're in this freewheeling, non-work kind of mode. And Sabbath has enabled a lightness in pastoral obligation, a realization that not only can't I do everything, I'm not supposed to do everything. That Jesus knew how to say no, that He knew how to retreat, that He knew how to leave needs unmet. I'm not sure I know how to do that apart from Sabbath. I think at the end of the day, what it has become for me is putting gas in the tank instead of sand. I put sand in so much, just more and more and more, and then wonder why the engine doesn't work. Well, because it's not intended to work on that. And so Sabbath has given me an opportunity to recalibrate, to remember who I am by remembering who God is, to relearn trust, and to live in the framework of a universe that is overseen by a loving God who invites me now to join him in his work and is happy for me to thrive in the work that he gives me to do as partner with him.